So hello, I am Mariana Mazzucato. I'm a professor at University College London. And I want to really thank the government of Chile for hosting this Clean Energy Ministerial and the Mission Innovation Ministerial Summit. And what I'd like to focus on today is how can we actually turn this idea of mission innovation from an idea, from a theory, into a reality, into real kind of new practices on the ground for all sorts of different actors, governments, businesses, third sector organizations, and especially how can we get them to relate one to another in a more purposeful way, really bringing this notion of stakeholder value to the core of the system of really how we do capitalism. And we know that, innovation doesn't just have a rate, it has a direction. And the problem is that we talk too much about the rate and too little about the direction. So what does it actually mean to bring a purposeful, mission-oriented, moonshot approach to this direction of economic growth, which we require, because it must become much more inclusive than it is right now, and definitely much more sustainable. We really need the concept, for example, of the Green Deal to become the deal through which all the different value-creating actors interrelate one to another. And for me, this is really about also going back to first principles. And I've focused a long time on policymaking and how we need to rethink the role of the state, the role of different types of public actors. These might be small actors, medium, large, transnational organization, national ones, city level ones, regional level ones. But my feeling is that we have had for too long the wrong framework to guide policymaking. And John Maynard Keynes, a very well-known economist, used to say that practitioners on the ground who think they're just getting the job done are often slaves of defunct economic theory. So part of my work, especially my new book called Mission Economy, A Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism, is about how do we debunk this very problematic and siloed way that we've thought about the role of the state and public policy in the economy. And in the process, how do we get much better practice? It's not just about better theory, but there's a relation between the two. And for me, it really, again, starts at first principles, this idea that at best, the role of the state is to fix market failures and to level the playing field and to enable others to do great things, including de-risking the risk-taking actors in the business community, is one of the first things we need to debunk. There is absolutely no way that we're going to have a global green transition or sustainable growth at the core of how we create value if we limit the role of the state in just fixing different types of market failures. By definition, it will always be too little, too late. Now, this doesn't mean we should throw out the market failure theory out with the, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Of course, that approach is useful, and people like Nick Stern have definitely helped us all think about how the negative externalities out there require real government action, and that action has to be now because the long run cost of not acting is much larger than the short run action. But the problem is it can't just be framed in terms of market fixing. Negative externalities, positive externalities, asymmetric information, all these different types of market failure inducing mechanisms, they help us patch up the system. They don't help us transform it. So for me, this is really about creating, co-creating, and co-shaping markets and asking ourselves, do we actually have the dynamic capabilities within state institutions, so the dynamic capabilities of the public sector, about co-creating and co-shaping the market? And for me, this is really about rethinking policy completely. So many different policies, whether they are industrial policies, innovation policies, development policies, basically often just become kind of handout machines, right? Giving money to different types of sectors, different types of firms, different types of technologies, different types of citizens. We don't actually often think about what is the goal? What are we trying to actually do? What are the problems out there? Whether they be getting the plastic out of the ocean or getting all our different cities and regions to be carbon neutral, what does that mean for the design of the policies? What does that mean for how we do everything? Public procurement. Procurement budgets are a huge percentage of government budgets. So what does an outcomes focus mean for how we design procurement, for how we design grants, loans, for how we design institutions like development banks and public banks globally, both the national and the multinational ones? So for me, this really required a new framework, and that's why I talk about missions for about 10 years now. why I talk about the entrepreneurial state, and why I talk about moonshot thinking. And for that, I just think it's useful to step back just for a minute, go back 51 years ago, and ask what got us to the moon. It was a huge amount of both public and private sector innovation and investment, but it was led by government. And if you go back to Kennedy's speech, he was very clear. It was going to be hard. It was going to be risky. It would require a lot of money, even though he was careful to say less than we spend on cigarettes and cigars every year. It would require admitting that sometimes we'll fail, as of course we did with the Apollo 1 fire, which killed 3 astronauts. And, the level of ambition was very much one that changed the way that in some ways government talk, or, governments, how they talk today are not how governments used to talk back then. When Kennedy said, we're going to do it because it's hard, not because it's easy, means we have to get rid of some of the vocabulary we have today. For example, the fact that we think that policy is just there to facilitate, which means making things easier, right, for someone else. Facile from Italian and Latin. So actually welcoming the difficulty, welcoming how hard it's going to be, but that the objective is so important that we have to do it, and we have to do it together. And it wasn't, it was quite interesting that after the Apollo 1 fire, one of the first things that NASA did was look inward. They said, our own organization needs to be much more dynamic, much more agile, much more flexible. One of the astronauts who died, Gus Grissom, yelled, in the hours just before the fire, how the hell are we going to get to the moon when we can't even talk between 2 or 3 buildings? So, which were the mission control buildings, and also where they were sitting at the time with the simulator. They couldn't hear anything. And, they really, reflected on what people talk about all the time today, these different types of government silos. And NASA basically rearranged its organization in order to be purpose-oriented, in order to welcome that experimentation and the difficulties that Kennedy talked about. And that meant that intra-organizational culture had to change. They also were very careful. They knew they had to partner with business, which of course they did, but they were careful to design the contracts in such a way that these were kind of purposeful contracts. So when NASA was interacting with so many different sectors, nutrition, electronics, materials, obviously aerospace, the whole software industry that came out of it, there was lots of public-private partnerships through, for example, these procurement contracts, but they designed these contracts in such a way that really would foster as much bottom-up innovation, but towards a public goal. So they changed the procurement contracts from being cost plus, where we just had kind of elevated and inflated, one could say, government budgets, just paying any cost that came along their way, towards fixed price, almost like a prize scheme, fixed price procurement contracts with constant incentives for innovation and investment in the business community. They were incentivized to do that. There was extra, amounts of money that you could earn by doing that, but it wasn't just send us any costs that come along your way. They also were very careful that the public sector had to remain innovative itself. There was the head of procurement, Ernest Brackett, who said, unless we ourselves within NASA, so within the state, remain innovative, invest in our own brains, our own knowledge creation, so R&D, we won't even know how to partner with the business community. We won't know how to write the terms of reference. And if you think today, one of the big lessons with COVID-19, at least here in Europe, where I'm standing, is we've realized just how much government capacity has been outsourced to the private sector. Of course, government and business should interact, but they both need to be equally capable, dynamic, and creative. And if the state continues to outsource its brain to consulting companies and so on, what you end up with is something that a Tory lord here in the UK called the infantilization of the public sector. So again, a really, really important lesson. And so, really, I think one of the key points of the moon landing, and which was absolutely a mission-oriented program, so mission innovation, calling out, of course, the name of your summit, was that in order to be mission-oriented, you need to partner. We need dynamic, mutualistic, symbiotic partnerships, not what, unfortunately, we often see in areas like the health sector, which one could argue sometimes are parasitic public-private partnerships. Huge amounts of public investment going in, and then we get the patents wrong. Patents which get kind of abused. They're too wide, they're too strong, they're too upstream. We get the price system wrong. If drugs are coming out of a publicly funded collective public and private partnership, what should that mean for the prices of the outcomes that come from that process? Anyway, so all these different issues of experimentation, risk-taking, designing public-private partnerships in such a way to be purposeful and mutualistic, I think are incredibly important. And we should remember that we're simply not moving fast enough in the sustainability space. The 2019 IPCC report argued that back then, that was 2 years ago, we only had 10 years left until climate breakdown was irreversible. And in 2019, subsidies to fossil fuel companies were estimated at something like $20 billion a year in the US and 55 billion a year in the European Union. And much more recently, in the COVID-19 recovery funding allocated to energy companies by G20 governments, something like 56% have been handed to fossil fuel projects, equivalent to $151 billion. So we're not moving. We're simply not moving at the pace that someone like Greta Thunberg said, when your house is on fire, what do? Do you sit there and debate? What should I do? Of course not. You get out. So we're not getting out of this crisis fast enough. And I just want to highlight again before my closing seconds here, you can't get out of a crisis if you don't actually rethink the first principles. How to bring purpose at the center of business, away from just maximizing shares, at the center of government organizations, creating and shaping markets, not just fixing them, but especially purpose at the center of those partnerships. This is the moment to walk the talk of stakeholder value, and we simply cannot afford not to. Thank you very much.